The Pacific War, a vast and brutal conflict spanning from 1941 to 1945, was one of the defining struggles of the 20th century. At its heart were two powerful nations with contrasting visions of the world. Imperial Japan, driven by ambitions of regional domination and resource acquisition, and the United States, determined to protect its interests and uphold its presence in the Pacific. In the years leading to the war, tensions had been steadily rising. Japan's expansion into China and Southeast Asia drew international condemnation and provoked economic measures from the West. The United States, alarmed by Japan's aggression, imposed embargoes on oil, steel, and other critical materials, striking at the very lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. Within this tense atmosphere, diplomacy faltered, and both nations edged closer to confrontation. Leaders in Tokyo believed swift, decisive action could secure Japan's dominance before American resistance became fully organized, while Washington braced for the possibility of a devastating surprise attack. By late 1941, the Pacific was a cauldron of strategic calculations, military preparations, and high-stakes decisions. Japan's leaders envisioned a vast empire stretching from the resource-rich islands of Southeast Asia to the strategic strongholds of the Western Pacific. Meanwhile, the United States fortified its positions in Hawaii, the Philippines, and beyond, preparing for a conflict that many hoped could still be avoided. The clash that followed would not only determine control of the Pacific, but reshape the course of the Second World War itself. As these two nations stood on the brink, the world watched, unaware of the scale of destruction, the heroism, and the profound consequences that were about to unfold. The Pacific War would test the limits of human endurance, the ingenuity of military strategy, and the resolve of nations, leaving scars that would last for generations. The early hours of December 7, 1941, marked a turning point in global history when Japan executed a meticulously planned surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Carriers and aircraft launched from distant islands, striking the United States Pacific Fleet with precision and devastating force. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were caught off guard, while hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The attack inflicted significant casualties, with over 2,000 American service members killed and many more wounded. Beyond the immediate destruction, the psychological shock reverberated across the United States, shattering any lingering belief that the Pacific was secure. In Tokyo, military leaders celebrated a strategic triumph, having crippled a fleet that could have challenged Japan's expansion in Southeast Asia. Within hours, Japan simultaneously advanced into the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong, demonstrating the scope of their coordinated offensive. Each move was calculated to secure vital resources, such as oil, rubber, and minerals, critical to sustaining Japan's war effort. The speed and efficiency of the Japanese attacks underscored their mastery of carrier-based warfare and highlighted the vulnerability of unprepared opponents. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his iconic Day of Infamy speech, galvanizing a nation and uniting public opinion in favor of war. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan, marking America's entry into the global conflict. This decision set in motion a vast mobilization of military forces, industry, and strategy as the United States faced the daunting challenge of countering a highly capable adversary across the immense expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a military blow, but a catalyst that transformed American society, inspiring both determination and a profound sense of purpose. As Japan consolidated its early gains, the stage was set for a prolonged struggle, one defined by fierce battles, remarkable ingenuity, and the extraordinary resilience of those who fought on both sides. The Pacific War had begun, and the conflict that would follow would shape the destiny of nations and the course of history itself. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor, Japan continued its rapid expansion across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, demonstrating both strategic cunning and ruthless efficiency. The fall of the Philippines was among the earliest and most significant victories for Japanese forces. American and Filipino defenders, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, fought with determination, but they were overwhelmed by Japan's superior numbers, coordination, and tactical surprise. Japanese troops executed swift amphibious landings, supported by artillery and air bombardment, cutting off defensive positions and disrupting communication lines. The defenders, despite their bravery, were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, where they endured severe shortages of food, medicine, and equipment. The eventual surrender in April 1942 led to the infamous Bataan Death March, where tens of thousands of prisoners of war were subjected to brutal forced marches, starvation, and violence. This event, horrifying in its cruelty, underscored Japan's unyielding commitment to its military objectives and the high human cost of expansion. Meanwhile, Japanese forces advanced rapidly in Southeast Asia, seizing British Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The invasion of Malaya began with landings on the east coast of the peninsula in December 1941, where Japanese infantry and tanks exploited weaknesses in the British defenses. Air superiority allowed Japan to strike key military installations, supply depots, and transportation hubs, crippling Allied mobility. The campaign moved swiftly down the peninsula, and by February 1942, British and Commonwealth forces were cornered in Singapore. The surrender of Singapore, often called the, quote, Gibraltar of the East, was a shocking defeat for the British Empire, resulting in the capture of over 80,000 Allied troops. The loss demonstrated both Japan's military prowess and the vulnerability of colonial powers in the region. At the same time, Japanese forces captured strategic territories in the Dutch East Indies, securing oil, rubber, and other resources essential for sustaining their war effort. The conquest of resource-rich islands, such as Java, Sumatra, and Borneo, allowed Japan to strengthen its logistical base and prepare for further operations across the Pacific. The Japanese successes were not limited to land campaigns. Naval and air operations were equally decisive, exploiting the weaknesses of Allied forces and maximizing Japan's technological and tactical advantages. Carrier-based aviation allowed Japan to strike distant targets with speed and accuracy, while land-based aircraft provided continuous support for ground operations. The coordination between air, naval, and land forces reflected meticulous planning and highlighted Japan's early mastery of modern combined arms warfare. At the same time, Allied forces struggled to adapt. Communication delays, underestimation of Japanese capabilities, and logistical challenges compounded the difficulties faced by commanders across the theater. Morale, though resilient among soldiers, was tested by the rapid succession of defeats and the harsh realities of jungle warfare, disease, and supply shortages. The psychological impact of Japanese expansion was profound. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, fear and uncertainty spread among both military personnel and civilian populations. Nations under threat, such as the Philippines, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, faced occupation, martial law, and the disruption of daily life. In the United States, the early string of Japanese victories fueled both shock and determination. Military planners began re-evaluating strategies, recognizing that halting Japan's advance would require not only reinforcements and new technology, but also coordinated efforts across vast distances and multiple fronts. The rapid early successes of Japan also prompted reflection on the vulnerability of key positions, including Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, highlighting the strategic necessity of maintaining supply lines and securing critical islands. Despite the remarkable achievements of the Japanese military, these early victories came at a cost. Troops were stretched thin across wide fronts, supply lines extended over vast distances, and the logistical demands of occupation became increasingly complex. In some areas, resistance persisted through guerrilla actions, sabotage, and continued Allied counterattacks, demonstrating that Japan's control was not unchallenged. The experience gained during these campaigns, however, hardened Japanese forces, improving coordination and combat efficiency, while simultaneously teaching the Allies crucial lessons in modern warfare, amphibious operations, and the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. By the end of this phase of the war, Japan had established a vast empire, stretching from the Philippines to Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. These early conquests solidified Japan's access to vital resources, secured strategic positions, and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated, multi-domain military operations. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the seeds of future challenges were being sown. The vast territories now under Japanese control were difficult to defend, communication lines were vulnerable, and the Allied powers were beginning to regroup, learn from their failures, and prepare for the counteroffensives that would eventually turn the tide of the Pacific War. The rapid expansion of Japan in the early months of the conflict highlighted both the brilliance and the risks of aggressive warfare, setting the stage for the prolonged and bloody struggle that would define the coming years of the Pacific theater. By mid-1942, the initial momentum of Japanese expansion began to encounter serious resistance. The United States, still reeling from early defeats, had regrouped and begun to strike back in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to June 7, 1942, represented the first major turning point of the Pacific War. Japanese planners sought to lure the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap, hoping to destroy them and secure unchallenged control of the Central Pacific. With intelligence breakthroughs, including the decryption of Japanese communications, American commanders anticipated the attack and prepared an ambush of their own. Admirals Chester Nimitz, Frank Jack Fletcher, and Raymond Spruance coordinated the defense, positioning carriers and aircraft to strike at the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese task force, confident in its superiority, advanced toward Midway Island with a sense of inevitability. However, American aircraft, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and land-based planes from Midway itself, launched waves of attacks with remarkable precision. In a matter of hours, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze and eventually sank, while the 4th, Hiryu, suffered a similar fate later in the day. American losses were significant but comparatively limited, and the destruction of Japan's carrier strength shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. The defeat at Midway halted Japan's expansion and forced a more defensive posture, demonstrating the critical role of intelligence, timing, and coordination in modern naval warfare. Following Midway, the focus of the Pacific War moved to the Solomon Islands, where Allied forces launched a counteroffensive aimed at halting Japanese advances and establishing a foothold for future operations. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942, tested the resilience, ingenuity, and endurance of both sides. American Marines landed on Guadalcanal to seize the strategically important Henderson Field, an airstrip that could dominate the surrounding sea lanes. Japanese forces, determined to retain control of the island, engaged in repeated land and sea battles, employing both conventional attacks and nighttime naval bombardments. The fighting was brutal, marked by intense jungle combat, supply shortages, disease, and harsh environmental conditions. Control of the air proved decisive in Guadalcanal. Henderson Field allowed American aircraft to interdict Japanese supply lines and provide crucial support to ground troops, while Japanese pilots conducted frequent raids in attempts to neutralize this advantage. Naval engagements, including the battles of Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and the Santa Cruz Islands, reflected the desperate contest for dominance in the waters surrounding the island. Both sides suffered heavy losses, with ships, aircraft, and personnel destroyed in combat that often seemed close to stalemate. The campaign exemplified the growing importance of integrated operations, combining land, sea, and air forces to achieve strategic objectives in a complex and unforgiving environment. Morale, endurance, and adaptability were tested on both sides. American forces endured harsh conditions, limited rations, and the constant threat of Japanese attack, yet their determination to hold Guadalcanal reflected a shift in momentum. Japanese troops, accustomed to rapid advances in the early months of the war, were forced into protracted defensive operations, struggling against both Allied pressure and logistical difficulties. The campaign revealed the limitations of Japanese supply chains and the growing strain on their ability to reinforce distant positions effectively. By February 1943, the Japanese made the difficult decision to withdraw from Guadalcanal, conceding the island to Allied forces and marking the first major sustained defeat for Japan in the Pacific theater. The significance of Midway and Guadalcanal extended beyond immediate territorial gains or losses. These battles demonstrated that Japanese forces were not invincible, and that careful planning, intelligence, and determination could offset their early advantages. They marked the beginning of a strategic shift in the Pacific War, from Japanese expansion to Allied counteroffensive operations. Midway preserved the core of the U.S. carrier fleet, allowing it to project power across the Pacific, while Guadalcanal provided a critical foothold for subsequent operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Both battles highlighted the importance of air power, logistics, and combined arms coordination in modern warfare, shaping the conduct of future campaigns. The experiences at Midway and Guadalcanal also forged a new sense of confidence among Allied forces. Commanders and troops learned to adapt to the unique challenges of Pacific combat, mastering amphibious operations, jungle warfare, and the integration of air and naval assets. The resilience and innovation displayed during these campaigns laid the foundation for the island-hopping strategy that would define the next phase of the war. For Japan, the losses were sobering, signaling that expansion could no longer be taken for granted, and that the Allies were capable of inflicting decisive defeats. The momentum had shifted, and the Pacific War entered a new phase, one defined by increasingly determined Allied offensives, strategic attrition, and the gradual rollback of Japanese conquests. By the conclusion of these pivotal battles, the balance of power in the Pacific had begun to tilt. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal were not merely tactical successes. They represented a broader turning point in the war, altering both strategy and morale for the combatants. The Japanese, forced onto the defensive, faced the long and costly challenge of holding their vast empire, while the United States and its allies gained the confidence and strategic position necessary to pursue the liberation of occupied territories and, ultimately, the defeat of Japan. These campaigns exemplified the interplay of intelligence, planning, endurance, and sacrifice that would continue to define the Pacific War for the next 3 years. With the victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Allies gained the initiative in the Pacific and began to implement a strategy that would define the next phase of the war: island hopping. This approach aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, capturing strategically significant islands to serve as bases for air operations and further advances toward Japan. Rather than attacking every Japanese stronghold, Allied forces focused on locations that offered tactical and logistical advantages, such as airfields, ports, and fuel depots, while leaving isolated enemy garrisons to wither. The strategy allowed the United States and its allies to maintain momentum, while minimizing unnecessary casualties and conserving resources for decisive battles. The island-hopping campaigns began in earnest with the assault on the Gilbert Islands in late 1943. Tarawa Atoll, heavily defended by Japanese forces, became a proving ground for amphibious warfare. Marines encountered fierce resistance, including well-prepared bunkers, machine gun nests, and obstacles designed to hinder landings. The battle highlighted the importance of pre-assault bombardments, coordination between naval and ground forces, and rapid adaptability in the face of unexpected challenges. Despite high casualties, the capture of Tarawa demonstrated that even heavily fortified positions could be overcome with meticulous planning and overwhelming firepower. From the Gilberts, Allied forces moved to the Marshall Islands, capturing Kwajalein and Eniwetok in early 1944. These operations provided vital forward bases, allowing airstrikes to reach Japanese positions further west and improving supply lines for the advancing forces. The successful seizure of these islands also served as valuable training and experience for troops and commanders, refining amphibious assault techniques that would be employed in subsequent campaigns. Each victory, though small in isolation, contributed to a broader strategy of advancing steadily toward Japan while weakening the enemy's ability to respond effectively. The Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, represented the next major objective in 1944. The capture of these islands had profound strategic significance. Airfields established on Saipan and Tinian allowed long-range bombers, such as the B-29 Superfortress, to reach the Japanese home islands, bringing the war directly to Japan's doorstep. The battles in the Marianas were characterized by intense combat, with Japanese defenders employing fierce resistance, banzai charges, and desperate attempts to repel the invaders. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire, suffering alongside military personnel. The capture of the Marianas not only enabled sustained strategic bombing campaigns but also severely damaged Japanese morale and demonstrated the growing superiority of Allied combined arms operations in the Pacific. Naval engagements remained critical throughout the island-hopping campaigns. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw the destruction of a large portion of Japan's carrier-based air strength. American pilots, equipped with superior training, tactics, and aircraft, decimated Japanese aviators, sinking carriers and planes, and further limiting Japan's ability to contest control of the Pacific. These losses compounded the difficulties Japan faced in defending its expanding empire, exposing vulnerabilities that Allied forces would exploit in subsequent operations. Strategic bombing became an increasingly important component of the Pacific War. The capture of islands with airfields allowed the United States to project air power over Japan and occupied territories, targeting military installations, industrial centers, and transportation networks. While precision bombing often proved difficult, the cumulative effect of sustained air raids disrupted production, damaged infrastructure, and imposed severe psychological strain on the Japanese population and military. The combination of island hopping and strategic bombing created a relentless pressure on Japan, weakening its ability to reinforce positions, resupply forces, and maintain effective defenses across the Pacific. The Japanese, though still formidable, were increasingly forced into a defensive posture. Their forces were spread thin across vast distances, relying on overstretched supply lines and facing increasing difficulty in coordinating responses to Allied advances. Kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by pilots against Allied ships, began to emerge as a desperate measure, reflecting both the resource constraints and the growing desperation of Japanese leadership. Despite these measures, the island-hopping strategy allowed the Allies to maintain the initiative, applying consistent pressure while preserving their own strength for decisive engagements. Each island captured represented more than a tactical gain. It was a step closer to Japan itself. Forward bases enabled further amphibious operations, refueling of aircraft and ships, and staging areas for logistics and troop movements. The cumulative effect of these campaigns eroded Japanese control across the Pacific and demonstrated the effectiveness of a methodical, strategically focused approach to warfare. By combining naval, air, and ground operations with intelligence, planning, and adaptability, the Allies began to dictate the pace and direction of the conflict. By late 1944, the island-hopping campaigns had successfully bypassed many of Japan's strongest fortifications, while isolating and neutralizing garrisons on skipped islands. The strategy had not only advanced the Allies closer to the Japanese home islands, but also demonstrated the importance of mobility, coordination, and adaptability in modern warfare. The Pacific theater had transformed into a contest of endurance, logistics, and strategy, where each successful operation built toward the ultimate objective, the defeat of Japan. These campaigns laid the foundation for the liberation of the Philippines, the capture of Iwo Jima, and the eventual assaults on Okinawa, bringing the Allies ever closer to the heart of the Japanese Empire. The combination of island hopping and strategic bombing illustrated a new form of warfare in the Pacific, one that leveraged technological superiority, meticulous planning, and relentless pressure to overcome a determined enemy. By controlling key positions, disrupting supply lines, and projecting power directly into enemy territory, the Allies set the stage for the final phase of the Pacific War, demonstrating that the path to victory required patience, precision, and the unwavering resolve of forces committed to ending the conflict. By late 1944, the Allied forces had established the momentum necessary to launch a decisive campaign to liberate the Philippines, a strategic archipelago that had been under Japanese occupation since the early months of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, fulfilling his famous promise, returned to lead the campaign, emphasizing both strategic necessity and symbolic importance. The liberation of the Philippines would cut Japanese supply lines, secure vital sea lanes, and provide a base for operations closer to the Japanese home islands. The operation involved massive coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, reflecting the lessons learned in earlier island-hopping campaigns and the growing sophistication of Allied amphibious warfare. The campaign began with the landing on Leyte in October 1944. American forces faced fierce Japanese resistance, including entrenched positions, artillery bombardments, and determined counterattacks. The rugged terrain, dense jungle, and complex network of rivers and roads complicated the advance, demanding both ingenuity and endurance from the troops. Naval support proved critical, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers providing artillery cover while aircraft maintained air superiority over the battlefield. The combination of naval firepower, air attacks, and coordinated ground assaults gradually broke Japanese defensive lines, allowing Allied forces to secure key objectives on the island. Simultaneously, Japanese forces sought to repel the invasion through a series of desperate measures, including the deployment of kamikaze attacks against Allied ships. These suicide missions inflicted significant damage, sinking vessels and causing casualties, but they were insufficient to halt the advance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf fought between October 23 and October 26, 1944, marked one of the largest naval engagements in history, resulting in a decisive Allied victory. Japanese carriers, battleships, and cruisers were destroyed or disabled, effectively crippling Japan's ability to project naval power in the Pacific. This victory secured the sea lanes for further operations in the Philippines and demonstrated the strategic effectiveness of combined arms operations in large-scale amphibious campaigns. Following the liberation of Leyte, the focus shifted to Luzon, the largest and most politically significant island in the Philippines. The landing at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945 initiated a grueling advance toward Manila, Japan's entrenched positions offering strong resistance in urban areas, hills, and river crossings. The battle for Manila was particularly devastating, with intense house-to-house fighting, artillery bombardments, and airstrikes causing widespread destruction. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, suffered greatly, highlighting the harsh realities of modern urban warfare. By March, American and Filipino forces had liberated Manila, dealing a severe blow to Japanese morale and consolidating Allied control over Luzon. While the Philippines campaign was underway, attention turned to Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island of immense strategic value. The island's airfields would allow fighter escorts for long-range bombers targeting Japan and provide emergency landing sites for damaged aircraft. The assault on Iwo Jima, which began in February 1945, was met with fierce resistance. Japanese forces had fortified the island with an extensive network of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions, allowing them to strike at advancing Marines with devastating effect. The initial landings were met with heavy fire, and progress inland was slow and costly. Combat on Iwo Jima tested the resilience, coordination, and determination of American forces. Marines faced constant artillery and sniper fire, booby traps, and the challenging volcanic terrain, which limited mobility and provided natural defensive advantages to the Japanese. Despite these difficulties, the combination of naval bombardment, airstrikes, and relentless infantry assaults gradually eroded Japanese positions. The battle was characterized by acts of extraordinary bravery and sacrifice on both sides, with high casualties reflecting the intensity of the fight. The iconic raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi symbolized the eventual success of the campaign, but the fighting continued for weeks, as Japanese defenders held out in tunnels and caves until their positions were systematically neutralized. The capture of Iwo Jima had profound strategic implications. The airfields enabled sustained bombing campaigns on the Japanese mainland and improved the safety and effectiveness of long-range air operations. The battle also highlighted the challenges of amphibious assaults on heavily fortified positions, reinforcing lessons learned from previous campaigns and informing planning for future operations, including Okinawa and potential invasions of Japan itself. At the same time, the experience underscored the human cost of these operations, with both military personnel and civilians enduring extreme hardship and loss. The combined efforts in the Philippines and Iwo Jima reflected a critical phase of the Pacific War. Allied forces demonstrated the ability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations, coordinate naval and air power, and overcome well-prepared defensive positions. Japanese forces, despite their determination and tactical skill, were increasingly on the defensive, facing resource shortages, attrition, and the cumulative impact of successive defeats. These campaigns not only brought the Allies closer to Japan, but also weakened the enemy's capacity to resist further incursions, setting the stage for the final battles that would ultimately decide the outcome of the Pacific theater. By mid-1945, the liberation of the Philippines and the capture of Iwo Jima had shifted the strategic balance decisively in favor of the Allies. The combination of tactical innovation, operational coordination, and unyielding determination allowed the United States and its allies to project power deeper into the Japanese-held Pacific, tightening the noose around Japan itself. These victories were not merely territorial. They represented the culmination of years of strategic planning, sacrifice, and relentless effort, demonstrating the resolve of Allied forces to bring the war to a successful conclusion and liberate the occupied nations of the Pacific. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, represented the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater and one of the final major confrontations before an anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. The island's strategic location, just 350 miles from Kyushu, made it a critical objective for the Allies, providing airfields and staging areas for operations aimed directly at Japan. American planners recognized the scale and difficulty of the operation, anticipating fierce resistance, and prepared an extensive combination of naval, air, and ground forces to secure the island. The battle would test endurance, logistics, and resolve in ways unprecedented in the Pacific War. Okinawa's Japanese defenders, numbering over 100,000 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had constructed an intricate network of fortifications, caves, and bunkers across the island's rugged terrain. Anticipating the amphibious assault, they employed a defensive strategy designed to inflict maximum casualties and prolong the fight, including concealed artillery, snipers, and machine gun positions. Unlike earlier campaigns where Japanese forces often attempted to repel landings at the beaches, Okinawa's defenders allowed the initial landings to occur and focused on attrition, forcing the Americans to fight inland under constant fire. The initial landings were met with sporadic resistance, but as American forces advanced, they encountered the full intensity of Japanese defenses. Jungle and urban combat created harrowing conditions for soldiers, while the island's geography, mountains, ridges, and dense vegetation complicated maneuvering and slowed progress. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the battle quickly became a grinding struggle of attrition. The Japanese employed kamikaze attacks extensively, targeting Allied naval vessels with suicide missions that inflicted significant damage and challenged the safety of supply and support operations. Despite these attacks, American naval and air superiority allowed reinforcements, supplies, and medical support to sustain the offensive. The fighting on Okinawa demonstrated the importance of coordinated operations and combined arms tactics. Infantry assaults were supported by artillery, tanks, and close air support, while naval gunfire provided long-range bombardment of fortified positions. Engineers and combat support units played a critical role in clearing obstacles, building roads, and maintaining supply lines under constant enemy fire. The complexity of the operation required flexibility, innovation, and rapid decision-making, testing the leadership and endurance of commanders and troops alike. As the battle progressed, Japanese forces engaged in desperate counterattacks, including banzai charges and last-ditch defensive actions aimed at delaying the American advance. These attacks, though often costly and ineffective in stopping the Allies, inflicted heavy casualties and exemplified the determination of Japanese soldiers to resist until the final moments. Civilian populations, trapped in combat zones and targeted by both artillery and airstrikes, suffered immensely, adding to the human toll of the campaign. The prolonged nature of the battle strained medical, logistical, and morale systems on both sides, highlighting the brutal reality of modern, large-scale amphibious warfare. By late June 1945, the Japanese defensive network had been systematically destroyed, and American forces secured the island, marking a decisive victory. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed or committed suicide rather than surrender, while American forces suffered over 12,000 killed and many more wounded. Civilians, numbering in the tens of thousands, were also killed, caught in the crossfire, or coerced into participating in Japanese defensive efforts. The devastation left Okinawa scarred, providing a sobering example of the scale of sacrifice required to achieve strategic objectives in the Pacific theater. The capture of Okinawa had significant strategic implications. The island provided a base for the buildup of forces and supplies necessary for a planned invasion of Japan, which would have been among the most challenging operations in military history. The ferocity of the battle and the high casualties reinforced the belief among Allied planners that a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in enormous loss of life for both sides. This realization, combined with Japan's demonstrated willingness to fight to the death, influenced subsequent decisions regarding the use of atomic weapons to compel surrender and avoid an even greater bloodbath. Okinawa also highlighted the evolving nature of warfare in the Pacific. The integration of air, sea, and land operations, along with logistical planning across vast distances, demonstrated the level of coordination necessary for success in modern combat. The battle revealed the limits of Japanese defensive strategy, showing that even well-prepared positions could not withstand overwhelming firepower, sustained pressure, and superior mobility. It underscored the psychological and physical toll of protracted warfare. emphasizing the importance of morale, leadership, and resilience in achieving victory. The lessons of Okinawa resonated beyond the immediate battlefield. The scale of casualties, the intensity of kamikaze attacks, and the destruction of infrastructure shaped Allied planning for the final stages of the Pacific War. The campaign reinforced the necessity of combined arms operations, the value of air superiority, and the impact of attritional warfare on both military forces and civilian populations. It also foreshadowed the final confrontations on Japanese territory, where the experience gained on Okinawa would guide operational decisions and inform the approach to concluding the conflict. By the end of the battle, Okinawa stood as both a strategic prize and a symbol of the devastating human cost of the Pacific War. The island's capture brought Allied forces to Japan's doorstep, paving the way for the ultimate conclusion of the conflict while underscoring the challenges that lay ahead. The bravery, endurance, and sacrifice displayed by soldiers on both sides reflected the intensity of a struggle that had reached its final and most desperate stages. The stage was set for the final actions of the war, with Japan weakened, Allied forces poised, and the outcome increasingly inevitable. By mid-1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. Japan, though still formidable, was exhausted. Its cities and industrial capacity weakened by months of sustained bombing campaigns, dwindling resources, and relentless attrition. The capture of Okinawa had brought Allied forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, and planners faced the prospect of an invasion that would undoubtedly result in staggering casualties on both sides. It was within this context that the United States made the fateful decision to employ a new and unprecedented weapon, the atomic bomb. The goal was to compel Japan to surrender swiftly, avoiding a conventional invasion and saving countless lives that would otherwise be lost in a protracted conflict. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima became the first target. The B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the uranium-based bomb, which detonated with unimaginable force, leveling much of the city and instantly killing tens of thousands of civilians and military personnel. Firestorms engulfed the city, and the blast left survivors with severe injuries, radiation sickness, and widespread devastation. The psychological and material impact was profound, shocking both the Japanese government and the civilian population. Japanese leaders, however, were divided over surrender, weighing national pride and the desire to preserve the emperor against the catastrophic reality of the new weapon and the imminent threat of further destruction. 3 days later, on August 9th, the city of Nagasaki was struck by a second bomb, this time plutonium-based. Nagasaki, an industrial hub, suffered similarly devastating effects, with tens of thousands killed instantly and many more wounded. The destruction compounded the previous shock from Hiroshima, leaving Japan with no clear means to continue resisting effectively. The atomic bombings demonstrated the unprecedented destructive capability of the Allies' new weapon, illustrating that continued resistance would result in unimaginable loss and suffering for the population. The bombings, combined with conventional firebombing campaigns and the ongoing blockade, left Japan's infrastructure, industry, and morale severely crippled. Faced with this overwhelming pressure, Emperor Hirohito intervened in a decisive manner. On August 15, 1945, he announced Japan's surrender in a radio address, urging his people to end hostilities to prevent further suffering and destruction. The surrender was both a military and political decision, reflecting the recognition that Japan could no longer continue the war and preserve its population or sovereignty. Allied leaders, while aware of the devastation caused by the atomic bomb, accepted the surrender as a necessary step to conclude the conflict and prevent additional loss of life. The announcement marked the end of years of intense combat, signaling the cessation of hostilities in the Pacific and the beginning of a complex process of occupation, reconstruction, and reconciliation. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender in the presence of Allied leaders, including General Douglas MacArthur, who accepted the document on behalf of the Allies. The ceremony was both symbolic and practical, formally ending the state of war and initiating the Allied occupation of Japan. The event underscored the magnitude of the conflict and the effort required to bring hostilities to a definitive conclusion. It also signaled the start of a new geopolitical era, with the United States emerging as a dominant power in the Pacific and Japan embarking on a path toward post-war recovery and demilitarization. The consequences of the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender were profound. The immediate loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and long-term health effects for survivors highlighted the unprecedented human cost of nuclear warfare. At the same time, the surrender spared further casualties that would have resulted from a conventional invasion of Japan, which planners estimated could have resulted in hundreds of thousands of Allied and Japanese deaths. The events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also fundamentally altered international relations, demonstrating the destructive potential of nuclear weapons and setting the stage for post-war arms control, deterrence strategies, and global debates over the ethics of atomic warfare. The Pacific War had been fought across vast distances, involving complex naval, air, and land operations, yet its conclusion was marked by the singular, transformative impact of the atomic bomb. The surrender of Japan brought relief and closure to millions of people affected by years of conflict, from soldiers on distant islands to civilians enduring occupation and bombardment. At the same time, the human toll remained staggering, leaving cities in ruins, families destroyed, and nations grappling with the moral and strategic consequences of modern warfare. The conclusion of the war marked a turning point in history, shaping military strategy, international relations, and the global order for decades to come. The end of hostilities in the Pacific also set the stage for the Allied occupation of Japan, led by General MacArthur, which would implement widespread reforms, demilitarization, and the establishment of a new political and economic framework. Japan's post-war reconstruction, while challenging, demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the nation, transforming it into a peaceful, prosperous country over the following decades. The legacy of the atomic bombings and the surrender served as a reminder of both the destructive power of modern technology and the imperative to pursue peace and stability in a world where global conflict had reached previously unimaginable scales. The surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945, officially concluded the Pacific War, bringing to an end one of the most brutal and consequential theaters of the Second World War. The campaign from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima and Nagasaki reflected the full spectrum of human courage, strategic ingenuity, and the devastating consequences of modern warfare. It marked the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and determination, leaving a legacy that would shape the post-war world and continue to inform military, political, and ethical considerations in the decades to come. The conclusion of the Pacific War in September 1945 marked the end of one of the most intense and transformative conflicts of the 20th century, leaving a profound legacy for Japan, the United States, and the wider world. The human cost was staggering. Millions of lives had been lost, including military personnel on both sides, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire of bombings, battles, and occupations. Cities across Japan and its occupied territories lay in ruins. Infrastructure had been destroyed and economies were shattered. Survivors faced the daunting challenges of rebuilding not only homes and livelihoods, but also entire communities devastated by years of relentless warfare. For Japan, the aftermath of the war was a period of reflection, reconstruction, and transformation. The Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, implemented sweeping reforms designed to demilitarize the nation, democratize its political system, and establish the foundations of a peaceful, post-war society. The Japanese Constitution, adopted in 1947, renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited the maintenance of armed forces for offensive purposes, fundamentally altering the nation's approach to security and international relations. Land reforms, educational restructuring, and economic initiatives sought to rebuild a society capable of sustaining peace while recovering from the immense social and economic disruptions of the conflict. Despite the hardships, Japan gradually emerged as a stable, prosperous nation, demonstrating remarkable resilience and adaptability. For the United States, victory in the Pacific cemented its position as a global superpower. The war had accelerated technological development, industrial capacity, and military organization, enabling the U.S. to project power across the Pacific and establish a dominant presence in East Asia. The lessons learned from the Pacific campaigns, ranging from amphibious operations to carrier-based naval warfare and strategic bombing, reshaped military doctrine and informed post-war planning. The conflict also highlighted the importance of intelligence, logistics, and combined arms coordination, influencing the structure and strategy of future U.S. military operations around the globe. The broader international implications of the Pacific War were equally profound. The use of atomic weapons, the scale of civilian casualties, and the total mobilization of societies for war underscored the destructive potential of modern industrialized conflict. Nations across the world recognized the necessity of international cooperation to prevent future wars of similar magnitude, leading to the establishment of the United Nations and the development of frameworks for global security, diplomacy, and post-war reconstruction. The Pacific War demonstrated both the devastation of total war and the importance of coordinated international efforts to maintain peace in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The war also left a lasting legacy in terms of memory, commemoration, and historical reflection. Sites such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki became enduring symbols of the destructive power of nuclear weapons and the human cost of conflict, prompting ongoing debates about ethics, strategy, and the responsibility of nations to protect civilian populations. Veterans of the Pacific campaigns, on both sides, carried the physical and psychological scars of combat for the remainder of their lives, serving as living reminders of the sacrifices made during the war. Monuments, museums, and educational programs were established to preserve the history of the conflict, ensuring that future generations could understand the causes, conduct, and consequences of the Pacific War. Economically and socially, the aftermath of the war prompted profound changes across the Pacific region. Japan's reconstruction, aided by Allied guidance and eventual reintegration into the global economy, set the stage for rapid industrialization and the development of modern infrastructure. Former colonies and occupied territories, including the Philippines and parts of Southeast Asia, embarked on processes of political and economic recovery, often coupled with movements for independence and self-determination. The redistribution of power and resources reshaped regional dynamics, altering relationships between nations and laying the groundwork for post-war alliances and conflicts in the broader Asia-Pacific region. The lessons of the Pacific War continued to influence military strategy and international relations for decades. The conflict demonstrated the critical importance of air and naval power, logistics, intelligence, and technological innovation. It highlighted the consequences of unbridled militarism, the vulnerabilities of civilian populations in total war, and the necessity of post-war planning to prevent future conflicts. The experiences of the Pacific War informed Cold War strategy, shaped U.S.-Japan relations, and contributed to the emergence of global frameworks for arms control, conflict resolution, and international cooperation. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Pacific War was defined by a combination of destruction, adaptation, and transformation. Nations devastated by conflict rebuilt and redefined themselves. Societies adjusted to new political and social realities, and the global balance of power shifted in ways that would shape the second half of the 20th century. The human, political, and economic consequences of the war underscored the immense costs of conflict, while also highlighting the capacity for recovery, innovation, and reconciliation. The Pacific War left a legacy of caution, resilience, and remembrance, ensuring that the lessons of the conflict would continue to inform history, policy, and the pursuit of peace for generations to come. Through this period of reconstruction and reflection, the world came to recognize both the horrors of total war and the potential for renewal. The sacrifices of soldiers and civilians, the strategic ingenuity displayed by military planners, and the profound social, political, and economic transformations that followed all contributed to a lasting understanding of the Pacific War's significance. The conflict's aftermath served as a reminder of the costs of aggression, the importance of international cooperation, and the enduring need to seek peaceful solutions to global challenges, leaving a historical imprint that continues to resonate across the Pacific and the world. The Pacific War, spanning from 1941 to 1945, left an indelible mark on the history of both Japan and the United States, as well as the broader world. From the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the conflict demonstrated the extremes of human courage, ingenuity, and the destructive capacity of modern warfare. The battles across the Pacific, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the beaches of Okinawa, revealed the importance of strategy, coordination, and resilience, while exposing the immense human cost of total war. The eventual surrender of Japan brought relief and closure, yet the scars of the conflict, both physical and psychological, remained for generations. The aftermath reshaped nations, societies, and international relations. Japan underwent profound transformation under Allied occupation, adopting a peaceful constitution and rebuilding a devastated society, while the United States emerged as a dominant global power, influencing the political and military landscape of the post-war world. The lessons of the Pacific War, about the value of preparation, intelligence, and the ethical implications of new weapons, continue to inform military strategy, diplomacy, and global policy. The conflict serves as a solemn reminder of both the horrors of war and the enduring capacity of nations and peoples to recover, rebuild, and strive for peace, ensuring that the sacrifices of the past are never forgotten.